I titled this a working definition of multicultural education because I think the idea of what multicultural education is constantly changing and evolving as our nation changes and evolves. It is an educational practice that is rooted in students and thus is more reactive to their needs. If I was pressed to define it, I would say that multicultural education encompasses educational practices and ideals that integrate the culture of students into the curriculum, instruction, and assessments in the classroom in a way that is student centered. James A. Banks noted that multicultural education is an idea, an educational reform, and a movement and a process. This viewpoint encapsulates the opinion that multicultural education includes far more than just the surface level inclusion of a book written by a diverse author or an artifact shared with the class. It requires the use of instruction that empowers and educates students about diverse cultures in a way that creates global citizens who learn to understand, appreciate, celebrate, and coexist with people of different backgrounds. So when we consider if multicultural education is one-dimensional, the answer is no. Going back to Banks, he really challenges educators to move past the surface level integration of culture into the classroom. In his work on multiculturalism's five dimensions, he notes that as one moves up the continuum of the five dimensions, more educators can become involved. What he means is that we often tend to put the focus on English teachers or social studies and history teachers to do most of the practices that we deem as multicultural, when in reality, for a school to really embrace multiculturalism, these practices need to span the entire curriculum. The second dimension Banks outlined is knowledge construction, where, as he puts it, we help kids understand. This is where teachers help students to understand the multiple viewpoints of historical moments that greatly affected diverse populations. He noted examples like understanding the westward expansion, how that affected the native people. The third dimension is equity pedagogy. This is when an educator analyzes their instruction to make it more than one dimensional, which is a practice that benefits all students. Teachers should vary their instructional practices so that everyone can access the curriculum. So this means integrating cooperative groups, problem-based learning, role-playing, etc. Really the instructional methods that appeal to more learners, not just our traditional lecturing. So this is where we see the tenets of differentiation overlapping with multicultural education. The fourth dimension is prejudice reduction, and this is where teachers are really getting to the heart of multicultural practices. So they're taking the time to address existing prejudice head-on and trying to develop, as Banks puts it, more positive racial attitudes. And I really think this spans to more positive attitudes towards other genders, sexual orientations, religions, etc., as well, and those kind of sort of conflicts that we are hearing about in the news lately. The last dimension is empowering school culture and social structure. And here the entire school needs to look at practices and traditions to make them more equitable. So we have tendency to track and label our students, the lack of diversity in staff. Anytime there's a group of students who are really achieving or receiving more than others, these things need to be addressed within the school culture. Multicultural education should be contextualized. Really all education should be. So we need to be placing learning in a context for our students in order to help them make connections, especially to their background knowledge. So what this looks like in terms of multicultural education may be that instead of simply reading a text about a historical event, the teacher is going to press the students to consider the viewpoints of many people involved and consider similar situations in the present day. Or like Laura Ladson-Billings wrote about, it would involve having parents come in to teach students how to create a certain kind of art or teaching them a skill. So teachers also need to be putting themselves into the context of education by going out into the community and connecting with families of their students, participating in events, reading and talking to people to really push themselves culturally as well, to understand how to frame these contexts for student learning. So what we're looking at is both the teachers and the students really being pushed in this learning and kind of gaining more context to connect to in the classroom. Multicultural education is grounded in social context theory, which has to do with looking at social changes that happen over time and how the needs of people change with these shifts. Teaching and learning are inherently social, so placing multiculturalism in the social context theory or even the social learning theory, and that's what positions the learning process in relation to how kind of we observe other behaviors and make sense of of that in the social context. Just makes sense when you think about education. Nieto wrote about the positioning of multicultural education within social context in her chapter that we read on learning the social context in multicultural education. And I think multiculturalism and its similarities to differentiation also speak to the zone of proximal development. So when we look at the zone of proximal development, we're looking at what can a child do on their own, what can they do with guidance, and what can they not yet do at all. And that goes back to what Latson Billings wrote about in her article, but that's just good teaching. And she really urged educators to get to know their students enough to help them bring their learning across these zones. And students do this with the help of teachers, but they also bridge these zones with the help of other students. So we have to allow them the opportunities to interact with each other through that cooperative learning, through group work, through problem-based learning, even through role playing. We need to give them the opportunities to interact with each other to create that learning. So all of that really places the ideas and tenets of multiculturalism within those social theories. These theories place multicultural education in the spotlight as a way to increase the effectiveness of teaching and learning. Diaz proposed the reason many students are not willing to or are unable to access the traditional curriculum is because it really doesn't speak to them. He noted studies that show that cooperative learning strategies produce greater gains for minority students, that students in lower tracts in schools receive far less instructional time. When you think about that, I mean, those are our kids that are struggling, that really need so much more instructional time than their average peers, and they need really good, challenging instructional time, but they're not getting that. And he noted another study where the classroom atmosphere, when students feel more relaxed in their classroom, they perform better, which just makes sense and just kind of speaks to the fact that we really need to know our students very, very well and create a very welcoming environment for them in order for them to make them successful. And while we may look at these studies and say, like Latson Billings, that's just good teaching, but there's still so many educators who are not embracing this good teaching, or they don't know how to effectively implement these practices. And we need to match teaching to the way students learn. The closer these two are, the more effective the learning process is. So yes, multicultural education has the power to positively affect teaching and learning, but as educators, we really need to constantly be having conversations about best practices and then actually implement them. Multicultural education is not fixed. Because our nation's population is constantly changing, the nature of instruction in the classroom must also be constantly changing. Culture itself is not fixed, it's always changing. Therefore, multicultural education must always be changing as well. So despite this constant change, the tenets and themes of multicultural education remain the same. So Howell and Lissy outlined the themes of multicultural education to include a commitment to being culturally responsive and responsible. And this is the belief that educators should really employ those culturally responsive practices in their classroom. The second theme is that teachers need to employ a wide range of teaching and learning practices to address the needs of all students, which we kind of talked about before. But it also applies to assessments, and I think our standardized tests don't always allow this, but we need to really move past the paper pencil, or in modern times, tablet stylus tests and assessments that we put students through, and really create a variety in that aspect too, to allow students to show their learning in different ways. The third common theme is that the curriculum should be expanded, and I kind of touched on this before, but Howell and Lissy wrote, the content must have meaning and relevance for students, or else it remains an academic exercise devoid of purpose. The last theme is systemic change, and I think this is where we start to really see multicultural education really move past just culturally responsive practices. So multicultural education really seeks to create this systemic change that makes education, educators, educational policy, educational practices embrace the diversity that exists in our nation. And laws and policies do affect multicultural education. I think Howell and Lissy noted, we still have a really big disconnect between the understanding that researchers and a lot of educators have about multicultural practices and then the actual laws and policies that are implemented. They noted the example of the requirements in the law to support English learners and how minimal they are in terms of what's actually needed for most students to fully learn and use English in the educational setting, not just conversationally. So that disconnect is there, and I think that speaks to the fact that most of our lawmakers are not that diverse. When they're the ones outlining the laws and policies, they may aim to better the situation, and they just don't have enough knowledge to fully understand what's needed to support teachers and students in creating multicultural schools. And history obviously affects the definition, and I think that's why our understanding of multicultural education is kind of always changing. Multicultural education grew out of the civil rights movement and the increase in immigration to the United States, and I think that the definition of multicultural education is not a stagnant one. So history will continue to impact what it looks like in our classrooms, and what it represents in the context of education. The fact that multicultural education did grow out of the civil rights movement shows that it's related to the bias and prejudice and equity that's found in our nation, and it's kind of spurred on by it, if you will. Every change in inclusion in multicultural education is tracked back to an inequality that a group faced. And culturally responsive or culturally relevant teaching and multicultural education, I think, really go hand in hand. At CRT, we are looking for teachers to understand themselves in the realm of culture, to show knowledge about other cultures, to place the student at the center, and so on. Those are many of the same practices that occur in multicultural education. Culturally responsive teaching CRT tends to have a greater focus on how culture affects learning capacity, and how we can use what we know about culture to kind of tailor instruction to students, whereas I think multicultural education, in my understanding, has a focus on how do we incorporate as much culture and as much analyzing of knowledge in relation to culture as possible in our schools. So to wrap up, Banks spoke of Gloria Ladson-Billings' work and noted that teachers who are most effective are warm demanders. I always like to find a little something in these pieces that we read that speaks to me very directly, and as a newer parent, this one did. So he talked about how the teachers who are tough until Christmas, or the ones who are kind of laissez-faire about their students' behavior and expectations of them are not always the most effective ones. The ones who are most effective kind of mirror what I read a lot about in parenting. That authoritative parenting is what we're finding to be most effective for children. So I'm not going to be the parent who doles out a heavy consequence, but I am going to have high expectations of you, and I am going to be highly responsive to you and highly understanding of who you are as a person in order to guide you to being able to be an effective adult one day. And I think that's what he's saying, and what Gloria Ladson-Billings is saying too about teachers, that yes, we have this great discrepancy between our white female teachers that are primarily in classrooms, and who they are teaching, but some of that can be overcome in the way that we teach and in the way that we interact with our students. So being highly responsive and highly demanding, warm demanders, as she puts it. As educators, we need to set those high expectations for children, and then we need to know how to help them get there. So we need to show them that we care about them and that we understand their cultures and that we really expect big things of them. And I think that really kind of sums up what I think is at the heart of effective multicultural education. And I think that at the heart of it is effective teachers who really understand their children that they're teaching, and where they're coming from and where they want to go. So that just about wraps it up for me. Thank you for listening.